yeah, let's just take you through a quick introduction of who we are and why we're interested in this topic, which is obviously the reconciliation measure that's currently being drafted and debated. So yeah, so a bit about us. Here at REMI, we're the nation's leading provider in dynamic economic impact analysis and modeling software at the state, local, and federal levels. We are committed, from the start to improving public policy through economic modeling and analysis, and we want to, inform decision makers about the implications of policies that will affect citizens' day-to-day lives. In 1980, we were founded on the idea that government decision makers should test the economic effects of their policies before they implement them, both so that they can plan for those likely effects and so that they can change course if that's appropriate. And yeah, we're inspired by one goal, which is just to improve public policy. So a bit more about us. Here are just a few of the people who use our software. It's a brief sample, but there's some people from every part of the economy and society. You can see we have state agencies, consultancies, interest groups like AARP and the NEA, intergovernmental organizations like the European Commission, and universities. And those really are a good cross section of the kinds of clients we serve. But we serve many organizations under the under each of those categories. So here's a brief overview of the reconciliation measure and why it's important today. So there's a few angles that it's approaching economic policy from, and it's all in service of Biden's quote unquote Build Back Better agenda. And just a fun fact, that's the same sort of slogan that Boris Johnson and the Conservative Party were using to talk about coming out of the coronavirus pandemic. So there's a little interesting factoid there, but more substantively, it seeks to advance educational equity through funding and increasing training for teachers, as well as trying to defray some of the costs that students face when attending higher education institutions. So it also is aimed at increasing access to healthcare, particularly in-home care for the elderly and disabled, and it has also in service of that goal increased funding for nurse training and similar types of programs. It also it's meant to tackle climate change by investing in a number of things like EV infrastructure, and sort of looming particularly large in this measure is weatherization and resiliency spending to help buildings better sort of weather the consequences of climate change. And it's also meant to increase the housing supply just by investing in affordable housing, and just increasing the total stock. So here's some more detail on the Build Back Better agenda that Biden laid out. It's meant to lower costs for those paying in education. It's meaning to provide universal preschool. Again, it remains to be seen if all of this stuff will stay in the measure, as it's still actively being sort of bumped back and forth between various stakeholders in both the House and the Senate. But they want to expand, give people universal free preschool, subsidized tuition at a large number of colleges, expanding Pell Grants, and 2 years of free community college. So these are targeted particularly at low-income individuals and families who will have a hard time affording education otherwise. For healthcare, there's reducing health insurance premiums, and as I mentioned before, the expansion of in-home care through Medicare and Medicaid, which is important for a lot of older and disabled people. And there's also another important thing here is the ACA premium tax credit, and that's just helping people reduce the costs of healthcare indirectly through giving them back money in their tax returns. And there's also housing tax credits that's again, meant to help families afford housing. There's also some tax cuts in here for specifically, working families and parents. So they're expanding the earned income tax credit, the childless worker tax credit, and they're extending the sort of emergency child tax credit measures that were in place from last year. And it's also meant to help create jobs and develop the American workforce through investing in more training and technical education, particularly as it pertains to apprenticeship programs, community colleges, and sort of employment training for teachers and nurses, because there's shortages of those types of people in a lot of locations throughout the U.S. And there's also clean energy jobs. So in the construction and manufacturing of EV infrastructure and weatherization, there's also a lot of jobs to be had in that. And maintaining that sort of infrastructure will also take a lot of people. And there's also, obviously investments in education, which is in the long-term investments in the workforce. But yeah, improving schools through investing in particularly HBCUs, teacher training, and helping more people, become teachers through teacher training and, helping more people afford higher education. So yeah, Gaisha will just quickly take you through an overview of the appropriations that are included in this. Again, it's going to be pretty brief, and we have a full table of all of them in the slides that'll be available for you if you want to take a look afterwards.
Yes, thank you, Jim. So as Jim stated, we are not going to get in the weeds here, but one thing in which that we did want to outline is the fact that the appropriations are going to be divvied out by committee, and then from those committees, they are going to allocate them based upon their priorities. But the most significant ones in which that we did want to point out were those with the largest amount of funding. So this includes the banking, housing, and as well as urban affairs sector, which is primarily going to go to the expansion of the affordable housing supply and things of that nature. And then the next one in which that we wanted to point out here was going to be the largest amount of funding, which is going to go to health, education, labor, and as well as pensions committee. And then so, as you all know, as Jim pointed out, in the Build Back Better agenda, one of the primary focus is workforce development, which is through education, as well as ensuring the fact that the population has the skills to meet the new economy that is coming upon all of us. And with that being said, we are going to hop straight into our methodology. And then so I'm going to explain to you all how we are going to economically model this. So to begin, the tool in which we're using is going to be our flagship REMI model, which is called the REMI Policy Insight Plus model, also known as PI Plus, which is going to give you all of the functions in which you need to do a holistic economic impact analysis. So it's going to give you your total employment output, gross domestic product, etc., in order for you to gain insights of the implications of your policy simulation. And then in addition to this, we're also going to use our newest module, which is called the REMI SEI, also known as the socio-economic indicators. And so what this does is that it gives you a more granular analysis into the components of your human capital. So this is going to let you explore your labor force participation by race and gender, as well as by different income quintiles. And so it really gives you the distributional effects that policy can have on different populations within your regions. And then so the way in which that we decided to craft this particular scenario is that we input the variables from the years 2022 until, we input the variables until 2022 until 2032. However, our observation period is until 2040. The reason for this is because we wanted to observe some long run and as well as short run effects of this policy, especially because inside of the Senate notes of the package, so inside the Senate notes of the package, they did include detail that this money would be appropriated over a course of 10 years. And then in addition to this, we decided to use our 70 sector NAICS code model with the SCI enabled. And I did want to note the fact that SCI could be added on to any model, just in case you are a user of TransSite, E3+, etc. And then so in order to capture these effects, so we decided to group them up between the social programs and as well as federal expenditures. And so if you're familiar with the model, we wanted to catch the direct, so we wanted to catch like the direct stimulative effects of spending. So this includes using some of our policy variables like government demand, capital stock, and as well as detailed investment. And additionally, for the social programs, we decided to use consumer price, production costs, and as well as detailed government output, and as well as a host of others. But this is just a summary of the different variables in which we use to craft this scenario. And with that being said, I'm going to turn it over to Jim, and he is going to explain our key results in which that we gained from this particular policy simulation.
All right, so yeah, here's a quick overview of GDP by region. So that's just showing you your percent difference over the average for every year in the forecast period. And just to clarify, this is not something where, this is GDP growth. We're not showing like 20% GDP growth for a bunch of years. That's not what's going on here. So you can see in the beginning, there's a little bit of a dip. And what that really is some of the cost factors that we put in, because we didn't just show the benefits of this. There are some costs that we saw in the proposed pay-fors. First of all, there's an increase in corporate taxes, which is one of Biden's sort of foremost proposals on how to pay for this. And there's an increase in taxes for individuals making more than $400,000 a year. We modeled that as an increase in capital costs because from our perspective, so these people have a really high marginal propensity to save, especially on the income that's above that $400,000 mark. Obviously, because as you make more money, you don't need to spend as much of it on necessities. We modeled this as an increase in the cost of capital because they have less. Because they're getting taxed more, they're saving less, and that means that the supply of loanable funds is smaller, and therefore the cost of debt would be higher, and also likely the cost of equity would be higher. So that's why we're modeling the cost of capital as increasing, and that's why you see that decline there. But you see a pretty steady increase over all the years, and that's as the long-term effect in terms of labor productivity, labor access, particularly from some of the broadband money that was initially proposed in the American Jobs Plan, and yeah, a lot of the other stuff in there, reducing people's consumer price or effective consumer prices. Basically, they're either giving tax credits to them or subsidizing certain types of things, so they're paying less, they have more disposable income, therefore they're spending more. And as productivity increases from some of those workforce development and education programs, you're seeing even more increases in GDP. And you can see that Idaho and Pennsylvania do particularly well, especially in the earlier years before the spending falls off. You can see Pennsylvania falls back into the pack there. But the state that benefits the least is Texas, and that seems to be due to the increases in capital costs associated with income tax increases on the high earners. And that would, because Texas is particularly concentrated in very capital intensive industries like oil extraction, that's going to result in a bigger hit on them than for other states or regions, but still they're seeing a substantial increase in their GDP above the baseline. All right, so here we can see for all regions, GDP output and real disposable personal income. And you can see that gross domestic product and output are really like very close to each other. They change about the same amount in every year in the forecast. But as we see, real disposable personal income goes up by a bit more than that, and that's just because of those subsidy programs and and programs that are just creating free services, like free pre-K, those sort of things. Those are freeing up basically part of people's incomes that they would normally allocate towards those things, and now they can spend on other things, and your real disposable personal income is going up because they're like the cost of living is going down. The effective consumer price of a bunch of these goods and services that are being subsidized is decreasing. Ergo, real incomes are increasing. That's pretty obvious. So we can see population here, and we're modeling this because of all the child care subsidies. We're modeling people as having more kids, and we're for the healthcare stuff, we're modeling an increase in the survival rate because there's more people who are having better care, and that's obviously going to result in the long run in fewer deaths. And the government would hope with all these sort of child care related things that it will result in more births, but that's and we gave them the benefit of the doubt. We assumed that this worked for them, but obviously there's a significant chance that that wouldn't happen because people's behavior towards having kids may not be particularly elastic when it comes to costs. We're not sure whether these programs will change people's behavior, but we're going to say, okay, let's assume the government's being smart and doing this. Let's see what happens if they're right about these programs increasing the birth rate. And we can see that Pennsylvania gained the most population, and that's not just because of birth rate. And obviously for Pennsylvania, this is a particularly big deal because they're a really slow growing state, particularly in the past 20 years. And this is not only just because of the child care stuff that's going on, but it's also because of another variable that we modeled, which was the broadband infrastructure is particularly helpful for white collar and business services, both access to labor in the form of telework and labor productivity, and just having faster internet in sort of office and white collar environments is more accretive to productivity than in other fields. So Pennsylvania, which has the Philadelphia and Pittsburgh metro areas, would benefit particularly relative to these other states. I mean, Texas obviously has a lot of major cities and white collar employment, but it is not as specialized in that field, and it also has a lot of extractives and other sorts of agriculture, manufacturing, other stuff that it's not sort of as specialized in these areas. So yeah, here you can see a little graph of employment by industry quintile, income quintile. That's a little very minor typo there, but yeah, income quintile. And we can see in the beginning things decrease. Again, that's because of those increases in corporate taxes and capital costs, but it's the long-term benefits and increased disposable personal income sort of spike up. You see more and more of that, especially for the years where the federal spending is still being disbursed. You see that accelerates pretty fast for particularly the second 20%, and that's partially related to the disbursement of the government funds and them fulfilling the contract, the contracts that are being issued to complete the projects that are being funded by the government. And you can see it's more sort of an even spread after the government spending is done. So yeah, that's about it. And here you can see for Idaho, there's actually a decrease in employment for the second 20% for most of the years, and it's a much smaller increase than for the other states and for the whole of the country. So that's likely because there's a lot of agricultural activity that goes on in Idaho, and it's a pretty capital intensive industry in the United States. The majority of agriculture is highly capital intensive, obviously, because it's all mechanized, and that might be because of the increased capital costs. But overall, there's still very solid gains for most income groups when it comes to employment. And we can see employment by race broken out here. For the beginning, it's pretty even, and then we're seeing, like, as the long-term benefits grow, that you're seeing the best outcomes for non-Hispanic white individuals, the second best outcomes for non-Hispanic Black, and then other non-Hispanic and Hispanic both are sort of fairly even. And yeah, it's pretty simple results here. Could you? Oh, employment by race in Texas. Yeah, it's pretty. Again, we're seeing very similar results in Texas. It's lower at first. The dip is a bit lower for Texas, and it stays low for a bit longer, and that's just because of the hit from the capital costs. But again, you're seeing non-Hispanic white doing the best, non-Hispanic Black second best, and other non-Hispanic and Hispanic doing pretty sort of like still doing pretty well, but being the lowest and sort of fairly similar to one another. And here we see employment by gender for all of the United States. Again, we're not seeing all that much in terms of a disparity here. Men are doing a little bit better when the spending first starts than women. And it's also interesting that the dip is deeper for them when the capital costs and tax increases first hit and the long-term benefits haven't sort of started up yet. But it's very even. It's for men and women in this scenario, because it's developing sort of many different parts of the workforce. It's spending on a lot of different things, so there wouldn't be a reason why this is an industry that's male or female dominated. It's going to be like the benefits are going to be skewed towards that. This is a very broad and far-reaching package, so it's going to hit industries that have different gender mixes. And you can see the unemployment rate. Just another disclaimer about what the numbers on the graph mean. It's showing comparisons to baseline, and it's percentage relative to the baseline unemployment rate. So it's not increasing by 8 percentage points. It's increasing by 8% of the baseline forecast unemployment rate. So it's like a percent of a percentage, and that's it's going up again when we see the taxes and capital, like the taxes and the associated capital cost problems sort of predominating in the dynamics of the model, and then it comes way down. And again, you're seeing unemployment rates that are lower, and they're not lower by 16 percentage points. It's the percent of the forecast. It's a percent of the baseline forecast. So it's we don't have a negative unemployment rate here. There's not like people who aren't in the labor force who are also like somehow working. That's not going on. It's just showing that there's a substantial and steeper and pretty accelerating reduction in unemployment while the spending's going out. And you can see it moves back up after 2032 because again that direct stimulative effect is gone, and you can see the sort of employment effects starting to wear off, because while the long-term benefits are still there and they're certainly keeping unemployment rates much lower than the baseline. So we modeled some of these sort of employment enhancing effects as decaying over time, like the labor access benefits and labor productivity benefits from broadband. For example, we modeled those as decaying with time because the infrastructure that's built, it depreciates, the population grows, so it's less like potent relative to the total population size. So we're modeling it as sort of getting less important over time, and that's reflected in unemployment creeping back up towards the baseline levels as time goes on. And yeah, here's Gaisha to walk us through a few key conclusions here.
Yes, thank you, Jim. So so Jim has just walked us through some of our key results. However, like he said, I'm just going to take the time here to wrap things up. So overall, we see that with the reconciliation package, it created significant gains in GDP and as well as gains in the middle income industries relative to the baseline, which is good because this means that it benefits the middle class the most in this context. And as well as it increased labor force participation rates, and as well as access to the labor force due to the structural investments. So that's with education and as well as the social programs. Some things in particular in which that we did notice with the industries is that it did benefit most. Well, it did benefit most. However, it did create relative winners and losers due to the targeted funding. So such as like the construction needed to build these different, in order to fulfill some of these infrastructure priorities. And as well as those when it came to manufacturing, which comes to the next point under industries, which is where we saw the kind of like the production loss across the board until the year 2024. But afterwards, every industry fared well, but those who, with the construction as well as manufacturing, did well throughout the simulation. The thing in particular in which that we noticed about the regions is that Pennsylvania and as well as Idaho experienced the biggest population boost and as well as the biggest percentage, the biggest percent change in GDP. However, Washington and as well as Texas did gain the least. Now, as far as population goes, we did notice, as Jim pointed out, is that men initially left the workforce at a higher rate than women. However, and when the simulation, or rather like when our observed period ended in 2040, we did notice that women actually participated more. And also all racial categories benefited, will gain access after 2024. And I did want to point out that in particular, the population and as well as the effects in which that we notice with demographic changes in industries and things like that are some key features of the SCI model. But however, the key economic indicators such as GDP output as well as GDP output and as well as your general population overview are key features in all of our models. So in addition to this, in addition to this, you may be asking yourself, why does economic modeling matter? Well, so it matters because it gives you 3 superpowers, which is to clarify, predict, and as well as inform. And then with the clarity thing is that it gives you the chance to understand the economic, fiscal, and as well as demographic implications of your proposed policies, and as well as to understand who benefits and also what magnitude of this effect will have on future generations. And as well as it gives you the power to predict the possible intended or unintended consequences of policies. And lastly, it gives you the chance to inform stakeholders of the potential pros and cons of policy, which gives you the chance to build a stronger, more fact-based, quantitative narrative. And so I did want to go over our approach. So the REMI model gives you the chance to clarify, calculate, and as well as communicate, as I said before, a quantitative narrative to policymakers and as well as the general public about the policies for your economy. And as Jim went over at the beginning of the PowerPoint, in the About Us section, so we have been doing rigorous economic analysis since the year 1980. And you can find us across the United States from California, whether that is analyzing the impacts of the Cal Recycle program or the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative in New England. And then before we get into our Q&A, I did want to close with why economic modeling is important, because it gives you the chance to forecast the effects of policies before they are implemented. And then, like I said before, whether or not, and as well as for you to know if this particular policy will have some unintended consequences in which that you didn't plan for. And as well as it allows for you to use facts in order to formalize the decision-making process, so as to get the policy right, and to enhance your chances of either passing or blocking certain legislation, and as well as to modernize and advance your agency. People tend to use our policy software for a multitude of things. This also, well, this includes, but is not limited to, bidding for grants, contracts, and as well as using it to prove the effects of certain circumstances and different research reports, and as well as it adds a level of quantitative rigor to proposals, which makes, in a sense, things more visible and as well as actionable to stakeholders and as well as decision makers who need to see more than just the qualitative effects of things.